So in this webinar, we're going to explore the hybrid experience and student wellbeing. Perhaps we might want to pause for a moment to consider what we mean by hybrid learning. And I have to say there are a very wide range of definitions out there, including a very wide range of titles: hybrid, high flex, mixed mode, etc. So we will need to think about what we're talking about as we go through. We know that the pandemic has caused a significant change to the learning experience, and that in fact the medium through which the learning experience is provided is still very much in flux. But what we plan to consider here is the focus on students and their well-being in a mixed mode or hybrid learning experience. Some of our students may engage online only. Some will experience both online and separate face-to-face components of their learning. And some students are learning in events in which there are both online and face-to-face participants and/or tutors in the same room, which we might term as the hybrid or mixed mode experience. Then there's the further complexity of synchronous and asynchronous learning and teaching. Our panel and audience may want to pick up on the format of learning as we go through today. So in this session, we hope to explore the impact of the diversity of these types of experience on student wellbeing. I'm delighted to introduce our panel today. And I hope my colleagues have both got their cameras on. Thank you very much. We got, sorry, I'm looking on my other screen now. We've got Anshima Varma, who is president of the Student Union at the University of London Institute in Paris. And she will be sharing the views and opinions of students towards hybrid teaching and learning and thinking about the hurdles of the system. Nichola Gretton is University of London's Digital and Learning Innovation Manager and a Centre for Distance Education Fellow. And she'll be talking to us today about a case study of Leicester's pedagogical practice, platform and policy position on hybrid learning and teaching through a student wellbeing lens. Nichola, if I might hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. As Linda said, I'm Digital and Learning Innovation Manager at the University of Leicester, and I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of our experience of hybrid learning and teaching. I'll be touching on pedagogy, practice, policy, platforms, all through a people lens, which of course are our students and their well-being. I have a couple of little sort of caveats. I'm not an expert in student wellbeing, and I also recognise that some institutions' practice in this area is far more developed than ours, but I really hope that it creates some food for thought and an interesting debate during our time together today, and hopefully some practical takeaways. So, at Leicester, when we went into the first lockdown, we were very lucky because we have 40 years experience of digital education and distance learning that we could draw upon and use to inform how we were going to create a high quality experience for our students. As Linda said, I think language is very important, and I think a lot of our thinking and direction of travel really brought in the high flex definition, although there were some nuances around that I'll touch upon in a moment. And we used all four of those fundamental values that BT defines as part of high flex courses. So thinking about the level of learner choice as we moved forward, and choice was given back to our students, equivalence, which isn't about creating something that is equal, but thinking about as people chose what type of session they wanted to attend, be it a synchronous live, or it could have been face-to-face live session, asynchronous learning, that they still were going to be successful in meeting the learning outcomes. Reusing activities that they were creating, so asynchronous content and recording things that were happening synchronously as well, and reusing that, so not teaching twice, making sure you always had the richness and the diversity of that whole cohort of students, and accessibility as well, so important, especially as things like digital poverty were coming to the fore, and just making sure there was no barriers to learning. So for us, the pedagogy and practice, after the lockdown and we were able to come back into campus more, we thought a lot about what we would do. And obviously it was a big jump for staff, a big change in practice, and we needed to build confidence. So we did support staff with doing something we were calling simulcasting, which was when an event would take place in the physical space and also online, so in parallel. But we were recognizing that that can be quite a challenge, because you want to make sure the student voice is being brought into the physical space and vice versa, and everybody feels connected and that sense of belonging. So we also recommended that was team taught in its first iteration, but obviously that's quite a high workload and quite difficult to sustain. So we had to think carefully about how we moved through then into the next academic year, this current academic year. And then we started to think about more hybrid experiences. And we had 9 of our schools who definitely had a very strong use case for wanting to use that pedagogical approach. And there was so much there to unpack and consider from a student lens, because obviously we'd really been focusing on getting strong practice, making sure the digital infrastructure could deliver what we wanted it to, thinking about the student duty of care there, but also thinking through what would happen if, say, for example, our students started to get into distress, say they've chosen to do their session remotely for a plethora of reasons. If they experience difficulty in a physical space, I think we sort of know roughly how we might approach that. We've got a degree of sort of muscle memory and experience. But when somebody's at a distance, they may be part of a large cohort, they have their cameras off potentially, and they do get into a level of difficulty or distress. How are we handling that? Because we don't know where they are, who they have around them. So there was an awful lot of consideration that had to be given to some of these elements and careful unpacking. And then sometimes you can tie yourself in knots and think, gosh, if we think about every single scenario and every individual aspect, and we want to see our students as individuals, then obviously that can then sort of almost stymie us from doing anything. So we really thought about building trust and empathy and moving into what I'll touch upon at the moment, which is sort of a compassionate and mindful curricula. So some of the challenges and barriers we had when we spoke to academics at the end of 2021 and thinking about coming into the second semester, this is how they categorised some of the challenges and barriers to creating hybrid experiences and making sure that students' wellbeing was being factored in. And actually, when handling, as I say, students maybe getting into distress at a distance, we were doing a change of practice, getting academics to think about points for regular question and answer, regular interactivity, regular touch points, making sure that those who decided to take the at a distance parallel session were being joined by those in the classroom, joining groups so that somebody online would be in a group that was within the physical space as well, which is really great for belonging and connectivity, and also making sure that our students don't sort of go into a term I've heard around becoming sort of a silent cohort, people who, you know, can just because they don't, for lots of very valid reasons, want to switch their camera on and just other reasons for just slowly maybe moving away. And also some of the learning that is lost in not waiting to go into a lecture theatre or bumping into somebody, and that serendipitous sort of impromptu learning that can happen. Dave White talks about ambient presence and co-presence and the university and that wider experience that sometimes can be lost with a hybrid experience. You're coming in and just having that structured engagement point and all the other parts of university life and the experience of the university. I'll use a single air quote there because my other hand's on the mouse there, but that sort of wider experience can be lost, and the university experience is then coming down to that interaction with the academic. They're the representation of that, and trust needs to be fostered and an empathy, which leads me into where we're going now with sort of pedagogy and practice, which is thinking about the work that Bridget Buick's doing at Leeds around the compassionate curriculum. And she made some interesting points around, quite often our curricula, we just build and build upon it. So a lot of what we have can be quite historical sometimes. And I think over the last 2 years, there's been big paradigm shifts and new thinking and wanting to retain all the things that have really benefited our students and their well-being. But if we're not careful, we're packing more and more in, and that in itself creates problems if we don't sort of think critically and take time to uncouple and realign and reimagine. So we started to think about compassionate curricula, mindful curricula. And I really like this quote by Hooks here about, and something I think speaks to my values about, to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we're to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply begin. So how's that playing out for us in practice? So that's pedagogy and practice, and sort of some of the thinking we've done. And this is a contextualized example. It was born from one of our schools by an academic who had done the ILM in coaching and mentoring, and they really valued those skills. And they started to grow and develop that and then bring that into their academic practice. And they formed something that they call Studywell. If anybody's interested in learning more about this, they're always very happy to talk about it and receive feedback. And what they've done is they've enabled their students to have some of those coaching skills and work in partnership with members of staff to try and alleviate some of the anxiety and some of the sort of well-being aspects of a hybrid experience and education in general. So what they do is they timetable 4 one-hour slots throughout the year. They work in partnership with the academic, so the students are trained in coaching. They're around topics where perhaps, again, in that hybrid example of a mixed mode and having all that choice and maybe sometimes not always knowing enough to make those choices and what's going to be beneficial to you and needing to scaffold that in a hybrid experience. They've chosen 4 core topics and then they work together and they work through that, and it empowers the students and it gives them agency, but in a way that is still slightly structured, so you know that it's still going to be beneficial to them as an individual and to being a successful learner. So moving now quickly onto platforms, I think our digital architecture is very similar to many people's in the way that we're using our virtual learning environment, which is Blackboard, Teams, Blackboard Collaborate. But thinking again about hybrid, what was interesting for us over the last 2 years is working with my team with one of the schools. What we did in terms of changing our architecture was we integrated a Microsoft Teams site to every Blackboard module site. So I see this as almost building an extension, another room onto our virtual campus with an interlinking door. So the environment becomes quite familiar. There's less environment to learn, because I think sometimes with all the different facets of a digital architecture, you can feel like you're being thrown around a campus and every room has something new in it and a different piece of equipment. And it can be very disorientating, very destabilizing, especially for students, the neurodiversity students and all students, because when you're trying to learn the environment and learn within it, the cognitive load is quite great. So now in hybrid, you've got lots of online spaces and physical spaces. So what we did is we coupled Microsoft Teams with Blackboard, and what this particular academic did is they thought, well, actually, what's the role of Blackboard? That's going to be my asynchronous learning activity. And the team site is going to be my synchronous online collaborative activity. And in making that distinction that the new part of the architecture created, it really helped them to break down what they were doing and rethink about their curriculum. So they in fact, the sort of the metaphor I have here of their case is the blender. So they not only blended environments, but they started to blend cohorts because they were the program director for a DL program and a campus-based one. So for dissertation students, they started to think about how they could capture the campus-based sessions and make those available to the DL students, bring their DL students into the Microsoft Teams area for collaboration and making that classroom really rich in bringing these different lenses and experiences and diversity. Started to apply all of the high flex principles without even knowing they were doing it. So it was fascinating to actually see that platform had driven change, because quite often, we're rightly sort of thinking about the practice and the pedagogy, but here the platform change had really refocused their thinking. And then what they went on to do is they worked very closely with their students. They used Microsoft Forms to keep that conversation going and really paying close attention to the student voice. They then used Power BI, another Teams feature, to represent that data so they could check that they were really surfacing what was happening and the value. And the DL students really, really enjoyed this because they said they felt that connection. They felt that sense of belonging with the university. The second very quick case study was the classic cameras on or off, and another platform-driven decision around hybrid learning and teaching and effect on student wellbeing. What another school did was take a very student-focused lens and a lens of empathy and compassion by crafting a set of survey questions that really was about, tell us about your personal experience. We notice your cameras aren't on. And it was so pertinent to this particular discipline that they were, because they needed to be able to see people, to see the body language, the facial expressions. That's all part of that discipline. So they needed to unpack what was happening. And actually the students said, if you told us to switch them on, we would have done, but you gave us choice. And we chose not to. So they needed to find out, well, why had you chosen not to? What can we be doing? And one of the key themes actually was around appearance. And that was interesting to me because I thought, well, what's the difference about your appearance on screen, as I am now, and if I was sitting with you now in a lecture theatre in the old way that we used to do conferences and these types of sessions together? And it's made us wonder about whether this is a new relationship with cameras, one that's perhaps different to the one they have in their perhaps their social media world or their personal world. And it's something to be unpicked further. But it was really, really interesting set of questions. And one of the questions I also really liked was the way that they'd asked then the students to think about, how do you think it feels for me as an educator? This is new for me too, to a degree, in this new hybrid way of working. And how do you think that might be creating barriers to me being able to effectively teach with you? And putting each other in each other's shoes really sort of got the empathy side of what they were doing. So just to quickly finish off, because I'm sure I'm coming very close to time or maybe over it, is policy. So I just wanted to, obviously something we're aware of is the Office for Students. Susan Orr will be leading a review around blended learning and reflecting on the past couple of years' experience. She's the incoming VC for De Montfort University, one of our neighbouring institutions. And it's going to be very interesting to see what the review raises. Because we know that, I think there was a wonky article by Debbie McVitie who was talking about they did a survey with education leaders, and they said the survey results of those they spoke to showed that student expectations are really driving change in this area. But at the same time, they're trying to marry up still delivering a quality experience. And by quality in that context, I'm thinking they're meaning sort of the quality standards and some of the governance around that. So there's a huge amount in terms of policy and guidance to unpack. But as I say, we're on a sort of a journey through this. We're moving our thinking forwards. We're taking a lot of reflection and critical thinking around it, because there is a lot. So we don't have a policy position, but we are moving and evolving and working really closely with everybody within the institution. So just to conclude, I think for me, something around the hybrid experience, thinking about student well-being, is this quote by Hooks. So I really do think that caring for the souls of our students, and this is why I particularly like the case study around the camera on and off and the empathy and some of the other work that we've been doing with our schools, and that movement into exploring a compassionate curriculum, a pedagogy of kindness, and some of those skills that perhaps we don't always factor into academic practice development and where they are and where they might sit in PG CAPs and other forms of academic practice development. So I hope that has fueled some fuel for thought there, and I'm very happy to take any questions. I appreciate I scratched the surface of lots of very, very meaty topics there. So thank you very much, Linda.
Okay, Anshima, can I hand over to you and invite you to share some of your experience from the student perspective?
Thank you. Yeah. Just to add on what Nichola was talking about, it was pretty spot on in terms of student experience as well. So just to give us a brief background, with the entire COVID experience, ULIP was entirely online at first. And then as restrictions eased, we did have a hybrid model where you could have the option to join on Teams. That was the platform that we used, online or on site. So we had a few students who were attending on site and a few students attending online. That was the main hybrid model that we used. There was discussion on pre-recorded lectures and in-person seminars that we had. There were a lot of pros and cons and much debate that happened with among students. There were different sides for students. It worked for some students, it did not work for some students. But I think it highlighted quite a few main pros and cons that would be good for discussion. The first was the flexibility that it provided. It did allow students to learn on their terms what works best for them, the environment that works best for them. It it reduced the impact of external circumstances or influences that might impact a student's education at any point, which was a really big factor for students to enjoy the whole hybrid learning situation. And it also allowed for students to watch the lectures from an environment that works best for them. So some students did talk about how a large group does not make them feel comfortable during COVID. So being able to isolate and attend lectures and participate in seminars was something that gave them the peace of mind to focus entirely on their education. But some students, on the other hand, did not find that too conducive to their learning because they were not able to remain engaged entirely through technology. They did talk about how some of the issues was the boundary of having this is a study zone and this is a rest zone. So not being able to get into a study mindset in different settings and environments, which is what some students talked about as a concern. But some students also did mention how the hybrid learning model that we had at ULIP really helped with how it worked for different and diverse learning styles. Some students prefer auditory learning, and that worked really well for them. So being able to listen to lectures at any given point, and that allowed them to engage much more with the content and being able to form their own arguments and learning the skills as they go. But some students that prefer face-to-face interaction and more of a visual learning style, they did have some issues with engaging. I personally did find it a little difficult to stay engaged the entirety of, for example, a 2-hour seminar on an online platform and a hybrid platform. But some students excelled a lot at it. So that was something that was very interesting to see how it worked really well for some students and it did not work that much for some other students. The biggest thing that I would talk about is how it really taught all students to have a great organizational skills and time management skills, simply because there is that level of disconnect that everybody seems to feel with online learning, hybrid learning. So it's similar to the point that Nichola was talking about that atmosphere of a university, being able to talk in the hallways about what you're studying and just having those informal conversations. That was key in maintaining that study atmosphere, being able to manage your time, being able to organize your study schedule, however any student studies. So that was something that was a big, overwhelming response that we got from students. And it was also when we were discussing this with tutors in terms of what would be best as we went forward with reducing restrictions, the conversation about passive versus active learning was a very huge debate with students and tutors alike. We had noticed that students became very comfortable in online platforms, but they had an issue with engaging as much as they would on site. So while they were following along entirely, they would not want to engage much in debates. People would have their cameras off, even if they would be asked to keep them on, simply because it just felt uncomfortable being in a different environment than your classrooms, essentially. And so that led to that bit of awkward silences every now and then in seminars and lectures, which some students really thought was a huge hindrance to their learning, because the same discussions that we were able to have in person, face to face, it was not possible as much. With the hybrid learning model that we did have, where some students attended online and some students attended in person, there was some concern regarding feeling disconnected from the group that was on site versus online, because whenever we did break out into smaller groups, as much as we tried to include the online cohort, it just wasn't possible and feasible to keep them within the smaller groups for discussion due to technological issues at any point. That was a huge concern as well. But overall, the consensus that I can probably say was that hybrid was preferred due to COVID specifically, especially after COVID, because students did feel that they could keep their learning going on their own times, at their own terms and at their own time. The possibility of being able to go back to look at lectures, the possibility of being able to join despite external circumstances that one faces in everyday life was really helpful. But I think the students did hope that these small hurdles that were pointed out as we were going through the hybrid learning program could be solved at some point in the future. And yeah,